Hi guys, welcome to this part of our chat application where we are going to see why we need a state management library like Redux for our application and how we can use Redux in our code, and then we are going to see the setup of Redux for our application. So let's see this diagram where we are having this app and then we are having user and auth in that. And in this auth we are checking if user is signed in or not. And this property that we are going to use here in our cart. So for doing that in normal application we need to make a lot of callbacks, like we need to lift our state to its parent so that this user sign-in will go to users and then app, and then that property should be used, should be passed to product and then this card. So we can see that this is a lot of messy things going on here. So what we propose, we propose a globally managed state using some state management library so that we can have a state alongside with this application that can be changed from every component of this application and whose states can be retrieved from any component of this application, so that we do not need to pass all the things to these children and parents. So now how the data in Redux flows. So we are going to see how Redux actually works. So there are three things in Redux. First is this store, and then this action that would be called by UI, whatever action we need to call, and then we have a reducers. So what store means, it is like a store of all data in our application. And what an action is, action is just a javascript object that defines what kind of changes we are trying to do in our application. Like in this action you can see type deposit. So it is defining a action type then that we want to deposit something, and then we have a reducer that reduces that actions and all its properties, that whatever we are passing it in payload and what kind of action should be done from there. So this reducers reduces that actions and make changes to the stores. So how reducer work? It takes two props. One is state and one is current state and one is action. So it changes the current state according to action and return a new state. And this action should be completely synchronous. If there is an asynchronous function, then that action would be passed to reducer, and reducer will directly change the state of our store without waiting for this asynchronous task to be completed. Then the question arises how we are going to call some APIs or something if we need that thing. So that's where Redux comes. It provides us a lot more functionality instead of this, that we can apply some middlewares also. So what middlewares do, it will do something with the action like some API calls or some asynchronous task or some change in actions. So it comes between this action and reducers and complete the asynchronous task or something else and then pass that action to the reducer. So this is a complete flow of Redux when we apply some middlewares in that, so that this action would first go to this middleware, it will call some APIs or some asynchronous tasks. Like in this application we are going to fetch some data from asynchronous storage of our device, that is a asynchronous task. So it will fetch data that if user is already logged in or not. So we are going to fetch that data and then pass that actions to this reducer. So if we go to the website of Redux, we can see that we can use two type of its libraries like React Redux and Redux Toolkit. So Redux Toolkit has come up like recently. So we are going to use React Redux for our application, that is also known as classical Redux. So what React Redux is? React Redux is officially React binding a library for Redux with React. Like we have React in our application, we can have Redux in our application, but to bind that thing so that our component can get data from Redux, we need a library that will bind them. So that library is React Redux. So we already have React in our application. So now we are going to install Redux and React Redux using yarn add redux and React Redux. And before going forward, I would like to define some more constant in our application that we are going to use. So we have added this logout button color as red, and we have created one more file named as login.js that is in this constant folder, and we have defined our status as if we are checking that user logged in or not, logged in or logged out. So now we are going to set up our Redux for our application. So we'll go to in this source folder, and then we'll create a directory named as Redux, in which we are having this directory named as actions and as reducers, and then we are going to have two files. First is store.js, that will be our store for our whole application, and then we have action types.js where we will define all our constants for our actions, like which type of action it is. So we are using this centralized file so that our action should not be repeated, because whatever action we will dispatch, it will go to all of the reducers, so that it should not be repeated. That's why we are going to create this centralized file for action types. And whatever actions and reducers you are going to use, you need to define that files in this action folder and this reducer folder. And in most of the cases, you need both of the files in action and reducer, so it is convenient to give the same names to both of them. So now we are going to define all our action in this action types. So we can define any string here. This action types would be used as a constant, so that we will not write the wrong spelling in action and reducer and everywhere. So you can define any string here, but it is convenient to write the reducer name that we are going to use in, and then this action. And this all action we are going to use in our auth reducer. That's why we have given auth/login here. So now we are in our auth reducer file, and we need to define our reducer as auth reducers. So let's just import some of the constants that we are going to use. So we are going to use action reducers, action types from action types, and then we are going to use one more constants from login status, from constants slash login status, and then we are going to define our initial state for our like store. So constant initial state, this initial state would be first called when our this initial state would be used to create the structure of our store. So we have user ID here as null, and then we have login status as default value as this L should be small, because we have a variable here, login status dot checking. So default value would be checking and user ID is null. And now we are going to define our auth reducers. So const auth reducer equal to, it will take state and action, and it will return a new state according to that action. And now we are going to use our switch case statement to reduce that action. So we are going to check the action type and do our things according to that type, and then we are going to give it a default property also. So why we need this? So if we have more than one reducers in our application, then whatever action we will pass, it will go to all of the reducer. It is the action for another reducer, not for this reducer. Then it should return the same state from this reducer. Otherwise there would be like we have not handled that case, this kind of error. So we are going to return the same state that we already have. And then we are going to define some action according to login, logout, auto login, and auto login success and auto login failed, that we have defined in these constants that we have defined in these action types. So let me just write that quickly. And now we have defined all of the action types that we are going to handle in this reducers. And then we have login, auto login success, logout, and auto logout failed. So for now our login and auto login success will work similarly, and our logout and auto logout failed will work similarly. And we have defined this differently because this is not the same thing. If we are going to grow our application more, then we need to do something when user auto login, and the different thing when user directly login from the screen. So let's just define, let's just return a state from here. So we are going to return a state that will contain this user ID, which would be passed in our action payload dot user ID that we will pass later. And we have login status here that we will set as login status dot logged in, and the same thing we are going to do in our auto login also. So we are going to return the same thing from here, and in logout we are going to set this user ID as null, and we are going to set this login status as logged out, and we are going to return the same thing from auto login failed also. So we have created our auth reducers, but we have not used this initial state. So how this initial state would be used? First of all, our store will call all of the reducers that would be registered there, and it will ask a initial state from that. So when it will call this auth reducer first, so this state would be null. So it is going to give it a null state, and its structure is also null. So we are going to give it a initial state that says that whenever something would be called when state would be equal to null, give this state, this initial state, as the default value. So when the store call this reducer at the first time, this initial state would be returned, and it will create its structure according to this object, and it will initialize its value like this. And now we are going to export our auth reducer. And now we are in this action file of our auth. And what an action is simply a JavaScript object. So we need to define two things in this JavaScript object. First one is type, second one is payload. So what is the use of this action file? It will just simply return us an object that would be passed in the dispatch function of our React Redux, and that dispatch function will take that object, and that action would be passed in this action properties of all reducers, and this state is been taken from the store, and then we will return a new state from here, and then that state would be stored in our store. So that's the work of this action file. So let's start by defining our login and logout function as login, and it will take a user ID to login as a prop, and then it will going to return a object. And we have defined two of the things in our reducer. One is action.type, and our data is in action.payload. So that's the thing that we are going to define here. So we have type as, so let's import these action types from action types so that we do not mess up with the spelling. And then we are going to give it a login type, and then we are going to give it a payload that would be a JavaScript object also, and we are going to give it a user ID equal to user ID. So that's how we are defining our login, and then we can similarly define our logout also. So let's just copy it here and log out, and it will not take any user ID because we do not need any user ID for logging out. And then we are going to define a type as logout, and we do not need to give anything to the payload, so we will just keep this object as empty. And then we are going to export also this function so that we can use it from our UI. So our UI will only interact with this actions functions from this action file. And now whenever the user login, what we need to save that information in our local storage also. Like all of these things are in Redux. Whenever you will close the application, this whole data would be lost and it will come back to its initial state. So for storing data to our application local state, we are going to use React Native Async Storage. So let's just start by installing that and import that package here. Import Async Storage from Async Storage, and now we are going to store this data. So let's just define some of the function for storing, retrieving and getting data from our async storage. So first function we are going to define is save user. Save user data. That would be a asynchronous function, because this async storage, all the function are asynchronous, and we can have synchronous function also, but we do not need that for now. So we are just going to use its asynchronous function, and then we are going to use a async storage dot set items, and it takes positional argument. So the first argument would be key and the second argument would be the value to that key. So async storage only store key value pairs in its storage. So our key is user data and our value would be a should be a string. So for converting our object into string, we are going to use json.stringify. So it will convert our object into string, and then we are going to give it an object that would be as user id equal to user id. So for newer version in JavaScript, if your key and value are like same, then you can just directly give a user ID also here. So let's just use this kind of syntax here, and then we are going to define another function as get user data. So it will get data from the from our asynchronous storage. Get user data, and it would also be a synchronous function, and it will not take any argument, and it will return us a object. So we are going to retrieve our user data from asynchronous storage using await and async storage dot get item, and this items, and now we need to pass the key to that item. So we have used user data as our key, so we are going to pass the same key here also. So we are going to pass user data, and now we have this user data as a string. So now we need to convert this string to object. So return JSON dot parse, and then we are going to give this as a object. We are going to return this as a object, and now we are going to define another function as delete user data, so that whenever someone logs out, we are going to delete this data from our asynchronous storage async, and then we are going to use async storage dot delete item or remove item, and then we are going to give it a key, which key we want to remove, which key item we want to remove from our data. So we have defined these three things, and let's just use it here. So we are going to use save user data, and one thing to notice is that this is a asynchronous function, but we are not using await here because we do not need that. We just need to return this function, and whenever this JavaScript engine will have its will be free, you just save user data to the asynchronous storage. So it will not be too long. It would be like a work of it will be like a waiting of some milliseconds, so we do not need to have that await here. And same with the logout also, we are going to delete data from our asynchronous storage. So now comes our auto login that we are going to use export constant auto login equal to, and now we are going to return something. But now in this case we need to wait for this asynchronous storage to give us something, the data. So we are going to use this get user data, and then we are going to use this data to determine if user is logged in or not. So it says that we need to have a function that is asynchronous, but Redux cannot have asynchronous actions. So that's why we are going to use Redux Thunk that will provide us a functionality so that we can dispatch a asynchronous function from our action. So let's just start by installing Redux Thunk using yarn add Redux Thunk. So now we can return an asynchronous action instead of an JavaScript object from our action. So we are going to return an asynchronous function, and it will take a prop as dispatch. That Redux Thunk will give this prop to us that we can use in our function now to dispatch our object after performing some asynchronous task. So we are going to get some data from our from our asynchronous storage, and then we are going to use await and here get user data from our asynchronous storage. And if this user data is not null, that is we have some data from our for our user, and then now we are going to auto login this user. So if this user data is not null, we are going to use this dispatch object that Redux Thunk will provide us, and we are going to now dispatch our action from here. And now we can give it a JavaScript object like this, like we have done earlier. And now we are going to define a type as action types dot auto login success, and then we are going to give it a payload of, payload means the data of that action, whatever we are going to pass. And in payload we are going to give it a user ID. User ID that would be equal to this user data dot user ID. So if this user data is not null, then we are going to dispatch a auto login success. Otherwise we are going to dispatch auto login failed from here. So we are going to dispatch an action that would be a JavaScript object with type of action types dot auto login failed and with a empty payload. So let's just save all of this, and now our action is ready and our reducer is also ready. And now we need to define our store. So we'll go to our store file and start defining our store there. So we need to import some of the things. So let's just, we need to import create store from Redux that would be used to create an instance of our store. And then we need to have an apply middleware from Redux also that would be used to apply this Redux Thunk middleware that we have just now installed. And then we have combine reducer function from Redux also that would be used to combine all of the reducers to one reducer, because the store will take only one reducer in its like prop. So we are going to combine all of the reducers and give it to the our stores. Then we are going to import Redux Thunk that we have just installed from Redux Thunk. And then we are going to import our auth reducer. And so in the similar way, if we have more than one reducer, we are going to import all of this that reducers here, and then we are going to create a root reducer that would be created using this combine reducer function, and this combine reducer will take object as an prop, and it will contain a key value pair, so it will create some slices of state in our store. So we have this auth reducer, so let's give this slice a name as auth, and its value would be this auth reducer that we have imported. And now we can create a restore constant store equal to create store from Redux, and we can pass a reducer here as a first argument. So we are going to pass this root reducer here, and for the second argument we can pass enhancer. So for enhancer we are going to pass this apply middleware as an enhancer. So there are a lot of enhancer that will enhance the store, so we are going to use this apply middlewares. And in this apply middleware we can give all of our middlewares by using a comma between them. We just have one middleware here, so let's just give that one only. And now our store is ready, and we are going to export this store from here. Export default store. So now we have created our auth actions, our auth reducers, and our store. And now we are going to use this in our app.js. So we have Redux and we have React, and now to bind both of them we have React Redux. So it provides a provider, import provider from React Redux, and we are going to use this provider to provide all our Redux state to our React or React Native. So we are just going to wrap all of these things inside this provider, and this provider takes a store as an argument. So we are going to give it a store that we will import now. So we are going to import store from redux/store, and then we are going to give this store to this provider. So now this store is available for all our components and its children inside this. So that's all for today's video. In the next video we are going to create some screens, and then we are going to see how we can use this store in our components, and how we can read data from store, write data from store using the hooks provided by React Redux. So stay tuned. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.